Hello, everybody, and welcome again to another Sensory Approach to Manual Therapy podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Bethany Ranes. Bethany is a research scientist, mainly in cognitive neuroscience. She was the lead scientist at the United Health Group. She is the principal investigator for the U.S. Army, which I'd like to talk to you about a little bit there in your role, especially as it pertains to what we want to talk about today, which is mainly head injuries and psychological trauma and also physiological trauma. And you also spent time as a scientist with the Betty Ford Clinic for Addiction, which also interests me because I actually taught a class last year that talked about pain, chronic pain as an addiction process inside the brain, as a
Yeah.
ritualistic addiction. And it actually got a lot of really negative feedback online.
Oh,
People really didn't like that concept, even though I'd come across quite a few research papers, and it was just like a 2-minute snippet that we'd put up as an advertisement with the Canadian Massage Conference, and some people really took offense to it, and I was amazed that they took offense to it. So I'd like to talk to you about that, but it may not be today's podcast. So
sure.
welcome.
No problem.
Do you want to introduce yourself to our listeners and let them know? A lot of the listeners here, they're big fans of neuroscience. They pay attention to a lot of that stuff, which is what a lot of our podcasts about. So we don't have to change our language or anything like that today. So welcome. And do you want to introduce yourself at all?
Sure. Yeah. I always joke that I'm everybody's friendly neighborhood neuroscientist. A lot of my work has always been in the translational side of things. So, while I have done some work as a lab rat in my life, working predominantly with forensic populations, actually, whenever I was doing more of my academic research, what really interests me is taking the things that are coming out of the lab, which some of them are just truly amazing, and helping to both translate them so people just understand them. So they're more accessible because everybody with a nervous system really should be able to have access to the newest neuroscience. It's important. It's not something for niche academics or scientists. It's for all of us. It's like our owner's manual to our mind. And I also do a lot of work in applied neuroscience. So I help companies and folks that have really cool ideas take what we're learning in neuroscience and actually make things out of it, which I love to do. So that way it's actually being used to help people kind of getting that gap between an idea and the application of the idea closed down as small as we possibly can.
That's actually one of the reasons why I was really interested in having you on as a guest, because a lot of the people who I've had on before who are neuroscientists or who speak about that as researchers, they're not necessarily clinicians. And you're not a
Mhm.
clinician, but you do have that applicable portion where it's not just the science, because the science, I just did a podcast last week, which is coming out in my next series, which is on placebos, which I know you and I spoke about the last time we talked. Um, and it's one of those things where it's research is great. It's really good to know something. But if it doesn't benefit somebody, then it's just knowledge, with no impact. And the impact is really where it's valuable. And as a person who's really interested in neuroscience myself, as a lot of my listeners will be, we are clinicians primarily. And so the information's great, but I want to know, what does that information make me do differently with my hands? What does that make me do differently as a clinician with my words and my vernacular and my environment? And so that's actually what I want to talk to you about, really, because this is going to be the final one in the series that I'm doing on trauma. The first one was an athlete who experienced trauma, Hillary Allen, and the second one was Brian, who I just spoke with a couple of weeks ago and put up. And he's a clinician who does something called trauma informed care. And I actually asked a lot of my followers on Instagram how many were aware of trauma informed care, and it was a surprising number who were not. And I was surprised by that. Yeah, there were quite a few who were unaware of what trauma informed care was. And actually, Wednesday, I'm doing something with the IASP on why trauma informed care is important for chronic pain. And so I wanted to get your just your a quick understanding from you on what trauma is, because it's kind of become a catch-all, And it's also
Yeah.
kind of become something that some people dismiss and some people latch on to. So how would you look at talking about to clients what trauma is in your mind as a scientist?
Sure. I could probably give a little context on this and that. As a scientist, as a person, I tend to have a very strong, what we would call like an evolutionary bend. I like to think that everything that we have, whether it's comfortable, uncomfortable, good or bad, all came or comes from some kind of an adaptive sort of ground spring. And trauma, I think, is a really great example of that. So, trauma is something that, not to give, it can be a catch-all because the word trauma it really just kind of means impact, right? So take that as you will. You're impacted by things all the time. And I think it's really gone through evolutions of, it's almost like fashion. What does trauma mean right now? And we've gone through, well, trauma is like major traumatic events, it's something that causes PTSD. It's something that if and you're talking about head injury, it's something that causes a serious issue like a concussion. Um, but yeah, at the end of the day, it's an impact. And what we're seeing more and more in the research is that it doesn't have to be as big as we used to think. So over the years in my work, lots of people have adopted this. There's this idea of big T trauma and little T trauma, right?
I mentioned
And
it in
we
my last
always,
podcast. You and I had
yes,
just
oh,
spoken
good.
before it, and I said big T, little T, and I
Big T, yes.
told the listeners you're going to talk about it with us.
So yes, the last decade has been dominated by this idea of like the big T trauma. I mean, and it's really not even just the last decade. It goes all the way back, and we think of folks like Bessel van der Kolk, who talked about how these large traumas in our lives will lead to more somatic issues, which I'll talk more about later. But this idea, it's always that it has to be some big thing. We talk a lot about adverse childhood events, right? The ACEs, and
It seemed
yeah,
like the big T had to be something that was significant enough that to the outside population, to the person not experiencing the trauma, that they could logically look at it and go, I can understand or
yeah,
empathize why that would be considered traumatic.
yeah,
Um, and
yeah.
and that seems like the old version. And it seems like that's changing now because you talk about things like bullying, you talk about things like gender
Hmm.
equality, you just talk about the systemic racism that exists. And these are things that, using the word systemic racism, that's a big T. But then we look at how it behaves people on a daily basis, where it's like tiny little things that are done all the time that are the systemic example of it. I had a guest on talking about burnout, Benny Vaughn, who's an African American massage therapist of great renown and a good friend. And he had just opened up a multi-million-dollar complex as the massage therapist when COVID started and
Oh,
during Black Lives Matter. And he's interracially married and he lives in rural Texas. And his wife got pulled over by the police, and he's talking about how he just sat there in the car with his hands on his lap. Him and I were talking, and it brought me to tears in the podcast. And he's just like, "Yeah, no, I know, you know what's going on." He was just like, "I know what's happening here. We didn't do anything wrong." And it was just the way and it's like, that's the little T with a big T consequence. And
yeah.
it's just amazing how the two have kind of become so intermingled.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. OMG is your source for engaging, relevant, evidence-based medical information. We feature interviews with top experts along with complimentary teaching slides and continuing education credits on selected podcasts. At onmedicalgrounds.com and on our OMG app, we provide perks to all posted podcasts by linking content so you can drink in more if you so choose. Please be sure to click the subscribe button to be alerted when we post new content, or download our app to get all of our podcasts, slides, and continuing education credits in one convenient location.
I wouldn't even want to anymore discriminate between the two. I think that systemic racism is a perfect example of this. So these little traumas are what is frequently referred to as death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Um, one of the terms that you hear often, particularly in the area of systemic racism or any kind of systemic discrimination, really is microaggressions. And that's really kind of come to the forefront, particularly since the Black Lives Matter movement, but just in general. And it's the little things that you can't point to because they're ubiquitous and they're sort of like they just creep and crawl everywhere at the cellular level. It's, an example I sometimes will give as a woman in a particular, particularly male dominated area. I was once at like it was a startup sort of round robin. We were seeing lots of pitches from lots of people about chronic pain. I was the only woman in the room. And I was sitting on the inside of a horseshoe, and I was like kind of sandwiched in, and I was just sitting there, and the pitch folks, the startups would move through us. And one of the CEOs for the startup, who of course will remain nameless, but got to ours and pointed at me and said, "Sweetheart, can you give me a coffee before we get started?" And it was just one of those little things that I bet lots of people wouldn't even notice. But he picked out that I was a woman in that room and just automatically assumed I was some kind of subservient role.
Doesn't help.
Luckily,
It definitely
yeah,
doesn't help that he started with the word sweetheart.
sweetheart.
It's
Oh,
like
honey, sweetheart.
one
Yeah,
of those
and
words
right,
that,
so
ooh.
it's those little things, right? Because you're just like, and I think they carry an extra burden of, well, it's just a little thing. And most people are gonna be like, well, this is such a little thing. You can just shrug it off, but they're happening so often, right? And that's a minor one compared to what people, I have the privilege of being a white woman and that one's terrible, right? So
You're talking
yeah.
to a white man in his mid 40s. It's not like I've been like when I talk about systemic racism, or like here in Canada, we're dealing a lot with the indigenous cultures. And my father's
Sure.
partially indigenous, and he's married to a full-blooded indigenous. And recently, over these, during the pandemic, there were these mass graves that were found during something called the 60s scoop here in Canada. And being a white male in my mid 40s, I'm always like, you know what, like it's hard to talk about this stuff because I'm the one on usually the giving end of this, not on the receiving end. And yet it's important to talk about. But it's exactly like you said, like those micro traumas. The one I remember is bullying as a kid. I was
Yeah,
bullied as a child.
sure.
And it's an example where people are like, oh, just toughen up, be harder, it builds character. That was the 80s mentality, which is, I'm an
Yes.
80s baby. Um, but now we look at it and we go, no, those little moments of bullying add up over time. And it's like death by a paper, a thousand cuts. Or, it's like obesity or overweight or malnutrition through consistently and constantly just always eating the same thing that you think is good. Or, oh, it's, that extra donut's not going to be what kills me. But over the
Yep.
course of a lifetime, that's 10,000 donuts, like, which
100% it's going to be. Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
So your brain works very similarly, and trauma is kind of this amazing process, frankly, when it comes to your survival system. When you take a step back, all due sensitivity that it can cause some very disruptive symptoms, but it is what has kept us alive. So what's happening is that, you have a neuroscience base of listeners, so I can go through this quickly, but your brain doesn't react, it predicts, right? And it predicts based on it's sort of a model of everything you've experienced. And that's what your memories are for. That's why we learn, is to predict and be better next time. When a trauma happens, whether it's a big T, little T, anything that we associate with harm or potential harm or threat is something that your brain takes extra special care, right? And that's when your amygdala starts to get involved with things, and it becomes now a survival issue. It becomes, I have to avoid this. I have to fight this. I have to freeze around this in order to survive. And whether, back in the olden days, of course, it was a bear, it was, saber-toothed tiger, whatever. We needed to know what that growl was. We needed to know what these tracks are. We need to know what the smell is or what kind of caves to look out for. And these days, it's mostly social, right? Most of our threats are psychosocial, but the exact same
Where we
system
are, at least. Where I mean,
abides. Where we
where
are,
we,
that's true.
yeah, because we look at some of the stuff going on in the world right now in Eastern Europe. We look in the Middle East. We look at a
Yes,
lot of places in Africa, still in the Sudan, and we're like, hey, it's for them, it's survival at a very
exactly.
different level. Yeah, it's
Exactly,
like
which is why yeah.
even here in Canada, I think we took in during the Ukraine war, we've taken in 80,000 refugees. And, there's been a lot of conversation about what's going to happen to the healthcare system in a couple of years when a lot of these
Yeah.
children who we've taken in grow up with all these memories of being a refugee from a foreign country who can't go back necessarily, who've lost love and family members, a lifestyle, identity, all these things like that. So
Yeah.
I did a talk last year at the Canadian Massage Conference called The Evolution of Pain. And I've talked to
Yeah.
some of my followers, some of my listeners about evolution. We've talked about it a lot. So the idea of evolution, to me, I love that, because a lot of people see pain, they see trauma as these negative things in our life, and they don't realize that, like, pain, chronic pain is a great example. John Zwarak, who I did another podcast, who is an evolutionary biologist guy, talks about him, and I talked about, without pain, without that concept, we wouldn't be bipedal, because
Right.
when we tried to stand up, over time, the fatigue and pain and chronic pain that came from having weak erectors and weak vertebral discs made it that they had to solidify, they had to get bigger, the muscles had to get stronger. So that pain led to an adaptive process.
Mhm.
Now, what you're saying is trauma is doing the same thing. Now, physiologically, I can understand some of the adaptations that pain will cause. What are some of the adaptations that we're getting evolutionary wise from the trauma response?
So trauma response is largely taking sensory cues from the environment that you usually unconsciously associated with threat and using them to predict that threat. We really don't have a whole big tool belt when it comes to our threat response as a human, species. So you're looking at what is frequently referred to as your fight, flight, or freeze. And so you're seeing that sympathetic activation is the fancy schmancy name for that, the
Hmm.
Scrabble word, as I like to say. But so what you generally will have is your brain takes in all of these cues, these sensory cues that in a healthy, non-threatening environment situation would be considered benign. A smell of something, a taste of something, the way the sun reflects off of something, right? All of these little cues that people who have not experienced the trauma would never even think twice about. However, if you've been through the trauma, it's something that unconsciously will activate your fight or flight. It starts to unconsciously activate that sympathetic response. And it can do so sort of quietly. And it can build up, and you might not even realize, especially if you're, somebody who tends to be go, go, go all the time. You don't have a whole lot of sort of what we would call interoceptive mindfulness, or this an attention to what's going on in your body all the time.
Yeah, we
You
call it
might not
kinesthetic
notice till it gets
awareness.
big.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
call it kinesthetic awareness, and it's the same thing that
kinesthetic awareness.
you don't have a
Perfect.
good one. Yeah.
Yeah, and we tend to turn that button down. We live in a kind of an anxious world, most of us, and so we've turned that volume down. So what will happen in this is it gets louder and louder. It needs your attention. That's the whole point of the system. So it'll
So
get higher and higher.
is that where, if we are having these trauma responses, but we're not paying attention to them because we're not aware of them, we don't have good kinesthetic awareness, we're not being mindful, whatever happens, we're distracted. Let's,
Mhm.
we could say kinesthetic lack awareness, dyskinesia, however, whatever scientific term we want to put to it. But we could also just say, I'm busy with something
I'm busy.
else
I'm
that,
distracted, or
yeah,
yeah,
that
I'm
logically
ignoring
is
you.
more, yeah, that logically is more important to me at the moment, that I have to focus on. Like, I'm
Yeah,
making dinner and I don't want to fight at the moment, as an
yeah,
example, because the kids have to eat and we have to eat.
yeah.
But what happens when that happens? Is it similar to what's going on with most? Because I often equate trauma responses and pain responses to be similar, because around
Yes.
predictive text, around predictive behavior, around long-term potentiation, around learning, they have very similar occurrences inside the brain.
Yeah.
So with pain, if we don't pay attention to it, the signal just keeps getting more significant if it's still dangerous to us, because it's saying, you're not going to pay attention to me now. I'm going to make it louder, so you will eventually pay attention to me. With trauma responses, are we seeing the similar thing happen, where it starts out small, and then because we're not aware of what those symptoms are, we don't pay attention, we don't stop and gather ourselves. And so eventually we see what's called a large trigger, or a large response, where somebody blows up, or they in French, we say énervé, and it has the word nerve in it, which I love, which is essentially you're overwhelmed at that point, and
Yeah.
you throw your keys, or you throw a fit, or you quit randomly, or whatever it is. And that's what's happening. It sounds like you're saying, is that if we don't pay attention to those signals, the trauma is eventually, the response is going to say, no, you're going to pay attention. It's, do you want to pay attention now, or when it's a lot bigger of a problem, kind of thing?
Absolutely. And especially when you have, a psychological trauma response, a lot of times the signals that are triggering it are all around you. It's pretty tough. It'll be a relationship that you are oftentimes seeing that person all the time and it's triggering you, or a behavior that you yourself might do that's triggering you. And a lot of those things can be very unconscious. So yeah, they're happening. That thing is not going away. So your brain is going to get persistently more panicked about getting your attention. And pain's interesting because it is tied very much into this process, in that it's part of this complex sort of immune response that you have, sort of say. And it's part of a macro immune response as opposed to your micro immune response, where it's kind of like stop, drop, and roll, right? Pain makes you stop. And it can very easily become associated with things where you start to feel it, whenever you need to just stop or get away from something that's causing that trauma response and you're just not responding to it. Pain also presents a unique challenge because we don't think of pain that way. When we think of pain, we think my body's broken. Oh my God, I've broken something. I've hurt something. And
that won't be
so
so
you're
much
feeling that.
Yeah, that won't be so much the case with our listeners, because a lot of them have done a lot of the pain study classes and
Okay,
pain sciences, and we
that's
understand now
good.
that there's this big shift of perceived threat versus structural biomechanical damage, and how we
Okay,
know the brain is very much engaged. And the good news is that is becoming much more part of the common culture. It's taken a long time
it
to get there.
is.
Rene
It is.
Descartes
And
to this day, but
it's moving fast. I remember whenever I first started having this conversation with executives like at United Health, and I would talk to rooms that had like surgeons who were just like, "You sound insane," but it is really true, and we're seeing it. I think it's gaining so much traction so fast because it's working. It
yeah,
makes a lot of sense. And when people do know that, it's wonderful because then you can use your pain as it's being used by your brain. You're kind of in parallel now. And you're like, okay, when I feel this pain, something is going on. I need to take a beat, look around. What is causing this? What is triggering this? It can be hard to figure out what is triggering a trauma response. It's not always obvious or easy. A lot of times it's normalized. It's a benign signal. You've normalized it, but it's also causing you a trauma trigger response. So that can be tough. And that's why you asked about trauma informed care. That's essentially at the heart of that trauma informed care piece is the idea that you've got something that might be both on one hand normalized and so normalized it's automatic and kind of invisible to you,
yeah.
but it's also triggering this immune response in you. It's triggering a safety alert, and it's really tough on your own or in a traditional non kind of trauma informed care system to figure out what the heck is going on. And what you don't want to do is to come about it in the wrong way, and accidentally trigger it more, or like, keep that triggering going on in a therapeutic environment. So now that place is not safe for you either. You don't want to start to associate the things from your therapy setting as being part of the trauma response. And that's the risk that can happen if it's somebody that doesn't have that trauma informed background.
So you bring up 2 points that I want to talk about. One that we'll talk about later, but I want to try to remember us get back to it, which is it sounds like the way you're describing trauma, that pain and trauma are part of the immune response, which logically I can wrap my brain around that concept really easily. But I also want to bring us into a little more of a nice little tidy little bow present of how that would be, because historically our immune response, we wouldn't consider trauma or pain to be part of it. We would say,
Right.
Okay, cytokines, inflammatory, white blood cells, we have osteocytes, all these things that are going on. That's your inflammatory response or your immune response. But it sounds like we're looking at something that might be pre-existent or part of the immune response, but that is before the chemical processing taking place. I want to get to that in a second. The first
Sure.
thing, though, that sounded really interesting to me was, and then I wanted to ask you about, is when we talk about those triggers, right? As massage therapists, we have a scope of practice, and the triggers, we're not allowed delving into them. We're not allowed going in, why do you have this trauma response? Was it because of XYZ? We don't do that. But what happens is, as a massage therapist, we are frequently treating someone and they have a trauma response. And we don't know the trigger. We don't know what we've done. And we don't even know if it was us. It may have been the music that came on. It may have been they were asleep and a memory popped in their brain. Like, it may not have anything to do with us. However, there's a good chance that it has something to do with us because of where we're touching the body, which is kind of our hypothesis. So when they have that trauma response, let's say tears, frustration, anger, whatever it is, at that point, it's obvious to both the clinician and the client, okay, a trauma response is happening. We need to, not tidy, we need to make sure that you feel safe. But before that trauma response happens, it sounds like that's the culmination of a multitude of responses that are ignored to get to that point. So those smaller responses that are often ignored because of either, let's say, lack of awareness, kinesthetic, whatever it is. As a therapist, we can probably pick some of those up. Like one of the ones that I think is more common that people don't associate with a trauma response that Brian and I spoke about in my last podcast is when we're treating a client and they're not cold and clammy and they're not sweaty. And then we go to an area of their body and they get cold and clammy and sweaty. To me, I've often associated that as a early warning that something is going on. Or they're really quiet through the session and then suddenly they start getting really chatty, or vice versa. They're really chatty and all of a sudden they go really quiet. Now, sometimes it's they just fall asleep. But to me, these are often signs, and a lot of therapists will say see these things. Can you think of any other more subtle signs that as therapists we can pay attention to say, not because the goal is not to avoid the response. I don't care. I don't care if somebody has a trauma response at my table. It might be good for them. I'm not looking to avoid it, but I'm also not looking to provoke it. I'm just looking to have the session come to fruition or whatever it is.
The purpose of any trauma response, whether it's large or small, and I should say too, before I go too far down this, sometimes there's only large trauma responses if the traumatizing event was also very large. So you want to take that into account as well. So folks who have been in like a war-torn environment or have had a near-death experience, it's very possible that they're going to kind of go from 0 to 60 because the intensity of that threat is so high that your brain just immediately goes to, just red alert. So sometimes it's not a matter of it building up to that, but with these microaggressions, with the things where you're steeped in the smaller traumas all the time, it frequently looks kind of like a gradual turning up of the volume, but it can sometimes just be a pow, big, loud one. Often the result of what we will call one trial learning, right? Where you have something that's so scary, you don't need that repeated. And so anyway, when that happens, whether you have, these more subtle, again, think of it as all being very tied into the immune response more broadly. And so this actually kind of fits in with the other question you were talking about. It's fascinating because you talk about cytokines and all those things. When you look at people who have PTSD, when you look at people who have a trauma history, you look at people who even have chronic pain, when you take a look at their blood samples, we see elevated cytokines. We see elevated issues of systemic inflammation. We see a persistent immune response. We see an elevated immune response to things in the brain and the, kind of throughout the nervous system. You see something called microglial activation, which is sort of like the brain's white blood cell response.
Does that mean that does that mean there's this is a far-fetched thought and I don't know if research has been done on it, but does that also mean that long-term you're seeing a higher ratio of let's say, rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, things like Hashimoto's disease, things that are inflammatory based illnesses as well? Yeah. Or is the research not been far enough around for that?
There's certainly research on what it mostly looks at is the correlations between a history of trauma, particularly in ACEs, and those conditions. One of my colleagues at United was an immunologist. We love having this discussion. His big dragon that he was trying to slay was rheumatoid arthritis while I was working on chronic pain. And we were constantly talking about the overlaps. But yes, autoimmune issues are frequently tied to trauma, just in the same way that chronic pain issues are. And it does not make the immune system any less real. That immune response is autonomic, just like the pain. So your brain is in charge of all of those things. Your brain, it handles all of those autonomic responses. So subtle trauma responses will frequently mimic other sorts of immune responses. You talk about cold and clammy or feverish. That's literally fever, right?
Yeah, and
things like just general touch is it's very powerful for us as humans because it's not a sense that we have quite as much flooding in as we do some of our other senses. We see people all the time. We hear people all the time. We talk to people all the time, but we don't always touch people all the time. And the less frequently you are touched, and especially in a safe or sort of just routine way, the more likely it is that any kind of touch is going to register as somewhat threatening for you because it will be novel. Anything
I
novel to the brain is threatening.
I
So if it's
teach
unusual,
I teach a lot of my students, and every class I teach a full class that I'll actually be teaching quite a bit here lately soon, and hopefully coming to Minnesota next year. And one of the things we talk about is stop with the painful treatment. Like,
yeah.
there's
Oh my
so
God,
much
yeah.
research that shows that painful treatment is non-effective. The no pain, no gain theory was popular in the 80s and has been debunked time and time and time again. And yet, the amount of times I'll receive a treatment or I hear of people saying it, that they've had treatment and they go, no, I couldn't handle it. It was too much pressure. It was painful, caused bruising, all these things that I'm like, there's so little value in doing that because it's like you said, you're now associating your therapy with a negative response. And
Danger.
yeah, and early on you might just go, okay, danger, negative response, that's not trauma. But that's for someone who has a regulated system. The moment they
Hmm.
have a dysregulated system, it's not, oh, that was slightly uncomfortable. It's that was threatening or it was non-threatening. Like there's no middle ground. And I think that's
Oh
something
yeah.
people forget with trauma is there's no volume control. It's an on or off thing. It's not a turn it up, turn it down kind of response.
Are we in threat? Are we not in threat? And in neuroscience, we talk about these experiences as being part of what's called a Bayesian style model. And if you're not familiar with what that means, it's kind of like just thinking about an ongoing average that you're constantly feeding in. And so, as soon as if you don't have a lot of data points, and then you have a particularly negative data point that you throw in there, well, now your average trends way over here to the negative. If you have lots and lots and lots and lots of data points and they're all fairly positive, one big negative thing isn't going to have as big of an effect. But if you don't have a lot of events and you have one bad one, it could be the exact same level of bad as this other person, but now yours is really going to set everything off. And then from
Because you have
that point
no
on,
anchor on the other end.
there's no anchor on the other end. And now that your normal expectation is threatening, every time you go in after that, it will continue to reinforce the threatening because you're
We
expecting the threat.
are you familiar with allostasis?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I teach that in my classes a lot. We give, and I give this to my clients in the clinic. They get a picture that I've drawn that has a glass on it, and I say, with a percentage point, draw a line on that glass. Tell me how full your life is. That glass is your life. And then they often ask questions, okay, well, what's in there? I go, everything. Gravity, going to the bathroom, your family, your job, your anger, everything unsaid, everything you've judged about yourself, everything you've judged about every other human, everything is in that glass. And the frequency of times where people put the glass at like 99.999% full,
Yeah.
I go, so you're just living in this constant state of hypervigilance for fear that the next piece of information input that's going to come at you is going to be perceived as threatening because you're going to be overwhelmed. Like you
Yeah.
have no room for anything else in your life. And I think that's the thing that is hard for a lot of people to remember around trauma, that if it's a small T trauma, it's almost like microdosing. You're getting such a
Yeah.
small amount that you think, oh, this should be fine. And yet they have this, what somebody would call exaggerated response, but it's not an exaggerated response. It's a completely justified response to their experience on the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what, yeah, exactly. So, and as this applies as a clinician, thinking about this. So when somebody's having these responses, all of them are seeking out the same end, and it's safety. Everything that you have as a trauma response, whether it's pain, whether it's sweaty palms, an elevated heartbeat, or just like a general sense of like, uh-oh, um, every single thing in that is meant to be a tool for your body, yourself, to find safety. And it's even a popular is one of the earlier evidence or trauma informed care curriculums was called Seeking Safety.
Yeah.
But what you can do in these situations that's helpful, no matter what, you don't want to ask them what triggered that or tell me more about that. But what you can do is reinforce that they are currently safe. Everything's fine. How do you do that? Well, you check in with them. Is this pressure okay? Are you feeling okay? What can I do to make it more pleasurable or more pleasant or more comfortable? Are you all right? Is the temperature all right? What can
I
I do
think
to help you?
one of the ones that I learned very early on, and it was actually in school, which I was really thankful for my teacher. It was Nate Buchan who taught me this. Um, who's some, I don't know if any of my listeners from, and you can take classes from him. He was a great teacher. I remember he said if they have a trauma response, if they have, like, let's say you're working their SOAS and they've been the victim of sexual abuse and you don't know that, and it's not on your intake form, because honestly, why would it be? You're not a psychologist. It's not, it's good to know if they've had trauma, but you don't necessarily need to know what the trauma is. So you're working, and the amount of times that this has happened in my career, and I'm sure a lot of the therapists is, they start crying on the table. And most people's response is to take your hands off the body and go, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And all that does is make the client go, what did I do wrong as a client? I started crying.
Yeah.
Whereas as a therapist, what we can do instead is we don't take our hands off the body. We just stop moving. We look at them, we get their attention, make sure they're conscious, and just say, do you need me to stop? Is this something
Yeah.
you want to continue to experience, or is this something you want to move away from? And we go work on another area of your body. And that gives them, one, a sense of power, which anybody who
Yep.
feels powerful feels safe. Another thing that I learned from Brian was, offer the opportunity for your clients to have the door open or closed during a session,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
for massage therapy is a little different because most of my sessions, clients are clothed, but that's not the case for a lot of massages. A lot of clients, people are undressed fully, and they're draped. But to say open door policy, that's a little different in that example. But it's also one that's interesting. And one that he did that he recommended that I've actually incorporated and that I really love, whether somebody has trauma or not, and I don't even ask the question, is I try not to stand between their eyes and the door.
Mm-hmm.
So the way my room is set up, if I want to treat the left shoulder, I'm standing between them and the door. So if I am going to treat their left shoulder, what I have them do is I'll have them turn on the table. So now I'm not standing between the door to treat their shoulder. And it's one of the more interesting ones that I've taken on unconsciously. And it hasn't really changed the session very much, but it's one of those things where they can see the door, just
Yeah.
safety
No,
kind of mechanisms.
it's excellent. All you want to do is promote everything about the session as being a safe place. I like what you said about empowerment, because that's very true. When you're in control, you generally will have an overall sense of feeling safe because you're in control. You can do what you need to do. I would encourage people to don't ask about traumas, particularly specific traumas, but what is really helpful, what you could do is just say, is there anything about the session today that you're nervous about? What can, anything? Are you nervous
Expectations.
about doing something wrong? Are you nervous about getting undressed? Are you nervous about the door being closed? Are you nervous about, not knowing what to do? Let them tell you, I'm a little uncomfortable with this, because you may not even know why. And when you try and ask somebody about traumas, a lot of people couldn't even tell you, right? The trauma might be completely unrelated, but
And a lot of
it's
them will feel,
happening.
a lot of people feel silly about their trauma when they
Yeah. Or
express
yeah.
what is a traumatic, like they'll go, I can't believe that is something I'm hanging on to. I'm about to be 44-year-old and I talk about being bullied. I still have moments where if I see something physical that looks like bullying as a 44-year-old man, that's not happening to me. I
Yeah.
still go into this phase of like total aggression of like, what the fuck is going on? And I get really angry, and I have to stop and go, wait a minute, this isn't happening to you. This is happening to another human. It has nothing to do with you to start with. Secondly,
Fight.
yeah, and who are you to project your BS and baggage onto them? But it's amazing because I look at that now and I go, come on, you know where your trauma comes from. I know where I was bullied and how. I know how to move beyond it. I feel like I'm able to meditate and be mindful, and yet those responses still happen. So a lot of people, they might look at it and go, that's such a silly thing to be traumatic over. That's such a silly thing to have. And yet, so they're not willing to claim like how important it is in their life. And yet it's something that holds value. So that's where, asking them where that trauma comes from, like a lot of people won't even admit that they have that trauma.
No, if they even know about it, there's so much shame around trauma. There's just an unwillingness to talk about it. It's important to also know, and you kind of brought this up, but trauma occurs in a different part of the brain than the prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking brain, which is our conscious brain. The part that we really control is that prefrontal. All those things that you can do, practicing mindfulness, metacognition, just knowing this is fine. I'm fine. I know I'm fine. Those things happen simultaneously with the trauma response. They don't cancel each other out. However, these can start to reduce, when done correctly, they can bring down that activation over here. It's not like they're unrelated, but
Yeah.
just because that you shouldn't feel scared does not mean that your trauma response is not going to activate.
And
So
just
it's
because you might be able
important
just because you might be able to help it one day doesn't mean the next day, when you're more tired or you didn't get enough sleep or you're more
right?
excited because you're not paying attention, that you'll be able to have that same controlled
That
response.
Yeah, you're going to have a little less ammo in the prefrontal tank. And this is all about practice. So this is where what we're talking about, what can really help make this prefrontal stuff more effective is pairing it with less cognitive things. So what's really great with a massage therapy session is that, as you mentioned, you have touch. Touch is powerful. And so when you have safe touch, that's going to reassure about 1,000 times more powerfully than just thinking, I should be safe. I don't know why I'm scared. I shouldn't be scared. So, these things of being able to create a sensory safe environment in the way that you're talking about and a sensory practice, the power of your sensory data as it comes in raw is much more powerful than the cognitions that you create in order to try and control something. So you're
You just
able
gave me the
to
title for this podcast. Sensory data, like that's a really good point. I mean,
it's all a data game.
yeah.
Yeah. And so your sensory data are powerful. The only problem with sensory data is that we're constantly flooded with it all the time. So your brain has learned to be selective. That's what the prediction thing actually evolved to take care of in the first place, is to figure out what's important and create, kind of create that. So you're controlling those sensory data. That's much more powerful than the thoughts that can be generated. And so it's really a valuable thing to leverage.
And I love that you bring up the predictive aspect because I'm pretty sure you must be familiar with ASMR.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I actually did a really interesting podcast. I have an entire massage technique called ASMR. I'm teaching it later this year. And it's literally tactile stimulus to replicate ASMR sensations. Now, not everybody has ASMR, but everybody can kind of get that spectrum of response where they get the free soul and the feel good responses. And I teach a section of my class on why is massage therapy effective? Why does massage therapy work? And there's a whole slew of material that I teach around that. It's a 2-day class, but the first part of the class, when everybody's the most awake and the most listening, is I introduce people to ASMR. And I say, listen, the likelihood that most of the responses, the feel good behavior that somebody walks away with from a massage, we can talk about structure and biomechanical behavior, and we can talk about whether you can find a trigger point or not. And the science really shows us we can't. We can talk about whether we're strong enough to stretch collagen, which again, the science shows we're able to, but my God, it would hurt. Like the actual old mentality of what we're doing with our hands compared to how much of an overlap there is between ASMR and massage therapy is amazing. And one of the biggest things is that with ASMR, prediction is key. Context and prediction. If you can create context, massage therapy, the context is kind of a given. You can highlight it more by having a therapeutic environment or a relaxing environment, music, lighting, all that kind of stuff. But context is a good given. But prediction is key. And so it's one of those things where during a session, never letting a client falling asleep and telling them what you're going to do next. A lot of my students have a hard time adapting that into their practice. But what does that also do? It diminishes the likelihood of a trauma response, because the client can sit there and say, oh, they're going to go work on my glute next. That's where I had my surgery. That's where I had my sciatic nerve. That's where I had my evulsive muscle, whatever it is. But they're going to go touch it. And that's why I came for treatment. So I'm ready for it, as opposed to I was asleep and now I woke up with an elbow in my glute. And so there's so much prediction behind it.
Well, and we talk about the amygdala as being sort of like the fear center of the brain or the threat center. What actually is the closest to truth is it's the unexpectedness detector. It's just that for humans, non-predictability and threat are pretty synonymous for us. When you can create that predictive model accurately for your patients, you're going to have something. If that's effective and they get it and it really does, they lean on that prediction. What you've done is you've literally done something that will deactivate amygdala activity. Like pretty significantly, it'll reduce it because none of it's unexpected. None of it's new or scary or novel.
So that's actually really interesting. Because one of the things I teach in my class is we do this thing. instead of doing trigger point therapy, it's like an updated version of trigger point therapy, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with as a non-massage therapist, but essentially you find a spot, trigger point, and you can't find them. So you have to have the client find them. So like I give my client an option. I say, which of these along this muscle tissue is the most sensitive? And they tell me what's the most sensitive. And then when you treat it, I say, okay, I'm going to apply pressure or I'm going to pinch this area. And I want you as the client to tell me before this is a grimace. And we don't want to go beyond a grimace, because as soon as you go beyond a grimace, you're into pain because you're in threat response, perceived as threat. But if we stop before the threat, the brain, kind of like a bra or underwear, the brain kind of just goes, oh, wait a minute. Is this threatening? No, it's
I'm
not
used to
threatening.
this.
And it
Yeah.
takes that level of influence, which is quite high, it's still enough to almost cause a grimace, but it goes, I don't care about this anymore. And then as a clinician, you don't change your pressure, and the brain just kind of says, I'm okay with this, and eventually forgets about it. And as that continues, the symptoms diminish. And then I tell my client, okay, when this pressure becomes very tolerable, I'm going to have you tell me so I can go in again, and you're going to stop me once more before it's a grimace. And by the fourth or fifth time we're doing this, we're at a level of pressure that is way beyond what could have been handled in the beginning without threat response.
Oh yeah.
But it's giving them this predictive behavior. They're in control, but it's also giving them a prediction where they know their limits, but they're able to predict the next thing to happen. And I had never thought about it in that way, where we're essentially bypassing the amygdala. I've never thought about it in that regard. That's really interesting to me.
You're doing graduate exposure therapy, which is a phobia therapy. And so you're
That's a
treating
whole
the
new thing to me.
sensitivity. Woo!
Yeah,
So when you have
graduated
phobias, you do something called graduated exposure therapy. It's a very well-established therapy. The example you always give somebody is fear of spiders, arachnophobia. And you start with a picture of a spider, something that just generates a little like ick, but nothing that panics you. And for some people, a picture of a spider will panic you. You got to move all the way down to the cute little itsy bitsy spider in a children's book and work your way through. You get to a point where you're comfortable, that you sit in safety with that stimulus until your body calms down, and you can practice breathing or whatever you need to do. But you get until you're normalized with it. It doesn't bother you anymore. And now we kick it up a little notch and we go up to like something until eventually you're like holding a tarantula in therapy or whatever. And so what you're doing is something I promote often with any kind of a manual therapist. Sensitivity in the body is essentially a phobia. It's a fear of that touch. It's an activation of the threat response when that body is touched. What you just described is exposure therapy. It's an exposure therapy paradigm for that fear of touch. So what you're doing is you're going in and you're like helping them at a place where the threat response is not activated until it's normalized. And then you're going a little further and then a little further. And at no point is the amygdala on edge. No, at no point are you scared, uncomfortable. You've gone too far if you're scared or uncomfortable, but you've created the situation. And by the end of the day, all of a sudden you're looking down and like this person's got a spider crawling on their head or whatever it may be. You are getting in there and able to help them.
I'm really happy because of confirmation bias. Like, that's fantastic. Like, makes me happy, right? I'm very frustrated.
All for the heuristics.
Now I have to go change my textbooks, because now there's a title to what this is doing. And I will definitely want to include that. And I'll want to go and find references to research and reference it, because that's fantastic. But I had no idea that's what that one is, but that's fantastic. And so that's how, is that something that you were doing when you were working with the military on like trauma responses around IEDs or around amputations or around loud noises and things like that?
That's a great jump. So there's really cool stuff going on with the military. I was more involved with brain injury and return to duty. So my research was really around seeing, I worked with a lot of PTs, OTs, and we looked at folks who had just finished rehabilitation for a head injury, and we knew that we needed to be the normal return to duty criteria were not sufficient. And we needed to make sure we had appropriate return to duty criteria to account for things that happened when you had a head injury, cognitive, changes and whatnot, vestibular changes, balance, dizziness, nausea. However, one of the things that's, I think, really cool that's come out of this that the military has been using is preemptively doing exposure therapy when somebody might have to go into a high trauma situation. It's, so it's graduated exposure training as opposed to graduated exposure therapy. And what you're doing is you're getting somebody, kind of gradually prepared for what might happen so that they don't have a trauma response when it happens. You're doing, again, very much like what you're describing. You're creating a predictive model for them in a safe place that they can use in advance so that they're not just dropped off in a new culture with a new language and new norms and new food and new smells. And on top of that, just danger, danger, danger.
And
So
don't go and get trigger happy because you're supposed to be a peacekeeper. And
exactly.
yet you're already
And
at your limit of capabilities.
yeah, if you're going and you're panicked, you're at a high, you're at red alert, your amygdala's firing like crazy, everything's going to look like a threat. And if your whole training as a military person, this goes with law enforcement too, right? If your whole training has been to just react automatically to threats by, shooting or reacting in that
You'll
way,
see threat
you're going
everywhere.
to have incidents, right?
Yeah, you're going to see
So
threat where there's no threat.
so this is a new way to approach that predictive training model instead of just like threat go, right? And anybody who's been in these situations will tell you, I didn't think about it. It just happened. Like I didn't even realize I was doing it. It just happened because they've been trained for that to be their automatic response. This is creating a whole different kind of training. It's a much more complex, much more thoughtful approach to this where you're keeping that person from feeling threatened in the first place. So they can remain calm and they can keep that prefrontal stuff going. They're not just reacting on adrenaline. So you've got somebody who goes and they know exactly what to expect. And there's things like that use VR for this. So you're fully
Yeah,
immersed in like a virtual version of where you're going to be. You practice what you need to do multiple times. There's a lot going on that I
I
think is
think
really fascinating.
I think one of the more popular examples of that would have been on Chris Hemsworth's six series documentary,
Mhm.
where he I can't remember what it's called. I'm blanking on it, but he puts
Limitless, I
Limitless,
think,
yeah,
right?
where he thinks about where he has to deal with heights, and he goes into a VR environment where he's on the top of the building, and then he actually has to go up on a height. And that's a really interesting example too, because I a lot of my history as a professional athletes and Olympic athletes and things like that, really, I mean, top of, some of the best in the world, literally in their sports. In fact, the lady who dealt with trauma, she was the number one ultra runner on the planet when I was seeing her, and she had this traumatic experience. She fell down a 150-foot scree field, essentially. But what you're describing to me is something that's been in the athletic industry for a long time, but I don't think they ever would have
Yeah.
equated it to gradiated exposure training, because that's what it was, though. That's what training on a treadmill or on a bike in the heat with dehydration for a 4 hour
Yep.
period where your heart rate, doing all these high intensity, that, like, essentially you're replicating a race environment where during the race environment you can perform at your best and not be reactive. You can be active in your thought process instead of reactive in your thought process. And I really
Hmm.
like that. I think that's amazing, because I think that's also a really interesting way of introducing touch to people who have become so focused on experiencing their chronic pain and their trauma, so focused on living with their discomfort, that in their mind they've come to a place of acceptance. I will always have this pain. It will never get better. I won't change.
Yes.
And I don't want to take that away. There are humans who really do have a scenario. Like, I have a lady who I saw this morning. She's had a titanium replacement in her shoulder. 8 years later, she can't lift her arm up above here. She can't even eat. She has to use her other arm. Now we're getting to a place where she can, like, just this morning, she was taking her shirt off, very difficultly. And yet we know there's a limit. We know at one point we will hit a wall with how much range of motion / discomfort she can experience. We just don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, they come to that place, and it sounds like that exposure training in advance. Like, one of the things we say in physical therapy, in a lot of rehab is, okay, you can't run for 15 minutes, but you can probably walk fast for 30 seconds and then walk slow for 30 seconds. And then with repetition, we bring back a higher level of performance. And it sounds like that would be considered gradiated exposure therapy as well in rehab.
Yeah. I mean, the entire context of training and rehab is essentially doing the microaggression trauma response in reverse. It's all of these little, instead of death by a thousand paper cuts, it's life by a thousand tiny
Feel
healings, and
thousand feel good
a
responses.
thousand feel good moments, a thousand lifetime movies or something, and it's like, and so when you talk, one thing that I think is really important, and with pain, one of my biggest issues with how chronic pain is treated in our conventional kind of environment right now, I ran into way too many people who were told right away upon getting an injury by a doctor that they'd be in pain for the rest of their lives. And I get nobody's trying, I accuse no one of malice. That is just the training that people are getting. But the power of an authority figure, particularly in a situation where you've probably just been in a car accident or a sports accident, and you're scared and you're in an ER and you don't know where you are, and you have this big authority figure, you're probably sitting or laying down while they're standing above you and they say you'll be in pain the rest of your life. The power of that is
Yeah.
unbelievable. And undoing that is incredibly difficult, but
And
not impossible.
your listeners that are listening right now, they are all the people in doing that. I promise you,
Yep.
because every time I teach at a convention, every time I go to a conference, as therapists, this is our biggest hubris is, how do we not gain the God complex while being the ones to help people recover, not only from their injuries, but also from what they've been told by people who have degrees in education that far outweigh our own. And yet the clients come see us and they go, I've been told I have a herniation, therefore I will have XYZ discomfort for this period of time for the rest of my life. And we as clinicians are somehow reversing this. And I'm not going to say, I guess reversing is absolutely not the right word, but we're somehow encouraging these clients to feel better, getting results. And so the hubris is, how do you not walk away going, hey, I'm top dog, and what you're saying is wrong? But at the same time, how do you go up to them and say, hey, by the way, what you're saying, we are seeing in the clinic is not happening. The words you
Yeah.
say don't manifest with our clients. So because I'm a massage therapist who doesn't have a degree, I walk up to a doctor and say this stuff. And mind you, I've been fortunate in that my circle, people have been very nice to me and they happen to listen to me. And I don't know why, and I'm grateful for it. But then I know that there are also a lot of times where they'll go, who are you? And why are you talking to me? What are you saying? You're wrong. Just because
Yeah.
of,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
It's awkward. One thing I want to say to you and to the listeners, because I feel like this is something not enough people realize. Doctors have to learn a lot of things about a lot of things. And so when you sit down and look at pain, this is the United States, but I think Canada is very close. The average, physician gets less training on pain than a veterinarian. So
I think there's
it's
something similar like
not,
that in anatomy as well. I think the average physical therapist and massage therapist will do 40 hours more of anatomy training than a general physician.
yes. So it's important to remember that even though they are such a deep authority for us in our health, when it comes to pain, they simply just aren't able to get all that information because they have to learn so much else that, for them is more urgent, right?
Yeah.
So when a doctor tells you, I know you'll be in pain, blah, 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 it's based on one of their lowest, volume topics in med school. The other thing I want to point out is that, we point to these things, herniations, spinal degeneration, all these kinds of issues. And well, no, I have this. My doctor told me that's what's causing my pain. I think it's important that people know that New England Journal of Medicine, this was a long time ago now. I want to say maybe like 20 years ago. I'll have to see if I can find the links so you can put it in like show notes or something. But they looked at people who had no back pain and they looked at people who did. And they realized that people with no back pain had just about the same number of spinal abnormalities as people who did. All these things we have always thought, because correlation and causation,
Yeah.
right?
There was
We
a
never thought to
study.
look at healthy people.
Yeah. I have a blog on my website that a lot of my listeners pay attention to. And my first blog post was a study, came out in 2019. I think it was the MECAR group. They did a meta-analysis of 3,111 subjects. And they
Yeah.
found they did MRIs and X-rays, and they gave it to a group of 60 clinicians. And the clinicians came away with saying 86% of the people need some version of intervention, surgery, injection, manual therapy, rehab, whatever it is. But the clinicians were unaware that 100% of the subjects had no pain for 6 months. Like, it was a
Yep.
criteria,
Yeah.
and yet 86%. And so I think that's becoming more understood, that structure and biomechanics have less, they're more correlated than causality based. Similar to the idea that your
Yeah.
posture's because of your pain, or your pain equals your pain is because of your posture. We're realizing it's the
No.
inverse. Your posture's
Yeah.
because of your pain. It's an adaptive process to
It's
cope with your
coping.
discomfort. Yeah.
Yeah, I like to think of spinal abnormalities like wrinkles. They're a sign of aging. Are they imperfections? Yeah. Are they kind of ugly to look at on imaging if you go real deep into it? Sure. Is it not ideal? I guess not. Do they hurt? Of course not. They're a normal thing that
Well,
happens when you age.
and that's actually something that is interesting because there was a big push for a while there to move away from this idea that structure and biomechanics and the pain neuroeducation became king, and that was the most important thing. And I think now it's important that we're seeing there's this shift. Okay, well, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. A broken arm does
Yes,
hurt. Your structure,
exactly.
there is a
Yeah.
reason for pain. A herniated disc can be painful. It's just not correlated one for one. It's not you have a herniated disc, you'll have pain.
It's
It's
going to be
it
painful. Yeah.
it can be the origin of your symptoms, but once it's recovered after 8 months, your symptoms should be gone. And if they persist, we now know there's not that relationship. But I think a lot
Yeah.
of people, they try to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're like, biomechanics and structure sucks. And I know I was guilty of that. But I think more and more I'm realizing, no, there is a healthy balance
There's a
between the two because
mix.
the body's a healthy
Yeah.
balance.
Exactly. Yeah. Though there's most certainly, and we have an entire process for structural pain, nociception, right? We've adapted as human beings to have nerves that whose whole job is to create pain sensations in the brain whenever there's damage to the body. So there's no doubt. Yeah. I am by no means saying that there is not structural damage, but I think for way too long, we've assumed that if there's pain, there must be structural damage. And that is not true. The 86% number that you threw out is really fascinating too, because recent studies have shown that that's about the number of people with chronic pain conditions who have no structural, issues, that
Oh, that's really
the
interesting.
pain is top down.
Yeah,
So it's
the
funny that
86 was a
that's
mix
similar.
of the 86 was a mix of low back, shoulder, knee. Like they had different areas of the body that did that, but that was the overall. Yeah.
I know that Howard Schubner's group just recently put out a study a couple months ago looking at this, and I think it could have been back and neck. I think it was back and neck. But they saw that I think it was like 85, 86% of people with back and neck pain, when they took a look at it, it wasn't the structural issue that they thought was causing the pain actually had no logical basis, that it was actually a lot of people will call it neuroplastic pain. I just call it top down. I think top down is
Yeah.
simpler. It's just
I mean,
it's
it's
coming
interesting.
from the brain.
Yeah. We
It's
there's so many
going
different
into your
names for it.
body.
We talk about down regulation, up regulation, dysregulated system, neuroplastic, nociplastic. There's so many different terms for it. We just
It's
know that it's
awful.
a version of integration between brain and body. And and
Yes.
that integration is variable for most humans, but that it is present in all humans kind of concept.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So very cool.
Well,
Well, that's yeah, very
I'm
interesting.
so grateful for the talk today. I really
Yeah.
am. I definitely want to have you back on in the future as another guest. I know we've already talked about potentially having you on to talk about placebos, which is going to be my next series. So I might be reaching out to you pretty soon to have you back on. And I am speaking with Minnesota to come out and teach there next year. And so when I do, I'll reach out to you because I mean, if it happens to be in the area where you are, I'll take you out for a coffee and we'll talk Dungeons and Dragons this time, and I'll talk to you
Oh
about
yeah.
why wizards are better than druids, and we'll just get into
Bring your character sheet. No, that
it.
sounds great. Yeah, looking forward to it. And any questions or anything I can help clarify that we talked about today, just let me know. I'm happy to.
Awesome. And is there anything that you would like, any of our listeners? Do you want to send them anywhere to your website? Do you want to have them for your consultation? Is there anything that you're interested in having them reach out for? Just that's okay.
I just actually launched a blog series on neuroscience education for anybody who's interested, on Medium. So the series is called Firing and Wiring, and it's just sort of weekly blog articles about just how the brain works and what that looks like in the real world, what you can do to take advantage of it. It's not necessarily tied to chronic pain specifically, although I have a feeling there will be lots of mentions of chronic pain over over time. But I think it could be a helpful resource for folks who are just generally interested or curious or excited about how your brain works. And so I've tried to put it in some kind of enjoyable bite-sized articles. Nothing's more than like a 5-minute read. I try to be mindful so I don't go on and on. But if anybody's
Awesome.
interested, by all means, check it out. I think it could be really interesting.
And send me the link. I'll make sure to put it in the podcast description so people can find it if they want to. That'd be great. And then I just want to say thanks. It's been a real joy today.
Yes, thank you. Likewise.